Welcome to this edition of Thought to Action, presented by the London Center for Policy Research. I'm Chris Cordani. This is where we look at issues, delve deep into them, and discuss thoughts, ideas, and solutions. Please join us on Patreon to help us produce this content and enjoy exclusive items, sneak previews of Thought to Action, and our intensive Ask Us Anything sessions. Also, what would really help us out is if you would subscribe to us on YouTube, Rumble, and or Dailymotion, and while on YouTube, hit that red bell for updates. Also, please feel free to comment and discuss this topic and share our video with friends, colleagues, and your social network. Find out more about us on our website, londoncenter.org. Our panel for today is London Center President Lieutenant Colonel retired Tony Shaffer, Senior Fellow Lieutenant Colonel British Army retired Tim Wilson, Distinguished Fellow Brian Griffin, and Distinguished Fellow Navy Captain Pete O'Brien. Gentlemen, there are a lot of articles out there about Secretary of State Antony Blinken, this time having the UN come in to investigate our nation's, I'm going to call it the wokeness quotient. He's going to say it's about our racism or whatever else, and you know how the language goes, the words go. But the question is for all of you, why is a sitting Secretary of State asking the UN to investigate the nation's level of wokeness, especially when the Biden administration is funneling a plethora of resources into establishing woke political, military, and cultural policies?
I always get in trouble for stating the obvious. We've just completed, according to Blinken and Joe Biden, the most secure election ever in U.S. history, with the greatest turnout and greatest participation, and they want to have that investigated? Excuse me? Think about that. Think about the complete lack of the clarity of their messaging and the fact of what they're trying to do. So they're trying to tell us that, oh, nothing to see here. This was the most secure election. Don't worry about it. You know, all these voices were heard, but now we need to bring in the UN to investigate. Really? So this is indicative of the real agenda. It's not about trying to ascertain fact. It's about trying to push an agenda that subordinates the United States to a larger global enterprise known as the Build Back Better movement. Joe Biden just talked yesterday about Build Back Better again from the perspective of trying to essentially recreate the social fabric of the nation for purposes of a better utopian path forward. That's what this is about. So when you examine this on the facts, just the facts, you can't have the most secure, most inclusive election ever and then want to have it investigated. It doesn't work like that. It's like, how do you build on it rather than how do you then investigate it? This is just someone using basic logic as a foundation to think this through. This is not rocket science, but I have not seen anybody in the media say what I just said. Maybe I'm wrong, but I have not seen that. So it's kind of like, how do you not put this together unless you're part of the agenda, which I think they are.
Bear in mind as well that he's asking the United Nations, perhaps the most inept organization in the world, certainly global leaders in ineptness. And for example, it's been over 20 years now, there's been a problem with peacekeeper rape. They brought in 1999, they did a huge review and changed their methodology and brought in a zero tolerance policy. And what they then did was charge the governments that supplied the troops with investigating allegations of rape. And it continues to this day. So there are...
So that was, yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So no, I was going to make my second point is this, the layered corruption of the UN and their inability to actually do any real investigations is a second factor of why would you do this if you really want something investigated. The UN's not an organization to investigate with any lack of with any real credibility. And the other thing, Tim, to remember regarding the UN is the fact that they don't actually go after nations which need to be investigated. I think we could all agree that there's an issue with the Uyghurs in China. I think death camps, something you probably should be investigating. Putin, our favorite punching bag, but it's like President for Life Putin. I mean, you know, it's like, you're not investigating that? I mean, what, you know, what?
And his Russian
Cuba?
Federation being a member of the Human Rights Council.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me
so
pick
it's
up
kind of
there.
like, dude, there's real offenders that you're not even paying attention to.
Let me pick up there, because I think what
Yeah.
we're getting at is that this move is entirely disingenuous, which has been what we've seen from the Biden administration and many of their policy moves. They're more important with their appearance, and they're more concerned with their appearance and their political agenda, with speaking to their base, than they are about doing anything serious or real about policy concerns that might face the United States. Here's the list of people that currently sit on the Human Rights Council at the United Nations. I've got it pulled up here. Bolivia, China, Cote d'Ivoire, Cuba, France, Gabon, Malawi, Mexico, Nepal, Pakistan, Russia, Senegal, Ukraine, the United Kingdom, and Uzbekistan. So right from that list, the fact that we have China, Pakistan, Cuba, among others, investigating human rights as if they have some position to speak from, and as if they can't analyze their own issues with human rights. I mean, it's fake. It's virtue signaling, right? Which is what this administration cares about. I think if any serious administration wanted to support the idea of building back, virtues and values in American society, then they would be focused on rebuilding the family, on bolstering the community and the church, which is where values and virtues come from, not from some international, conglomeration of countries with horrible records on human rights who are going to somehow be able to tell us how we can fix our own record.
Having followed the UN for a long time and looked into a lot of their corruption, a lot of people regard the Turtle Bay headquarters as the dictator's clubhouse. And you see very clearly every year, all the dictators of the world troop in there if they can possibly get there. Why? To give themselves legitimacy in front of their own people, saying, look, the UN lets us do this. The US, on US soil, it gives legitimacy. And it's interesting to me that now the Biden administration with Blinken is also trying to gain legitimacy from merely being in the UN.
Well, if I can just add couple minor points. One, that the High Commissioner on Human Rights, Bachelet, I believe her name is Michelle Bachelet.
Yep.
Is a socialist. There's a very large number of the countries on the list that Brian just read off who are socialists, and their findings are inevitably leaning hard over to the issue of a socialist agenda. And it doesn't take a lot to draw out the necessary conclusion that when they are invited into a country to conduct some sort of investigation or whatever, that the conclusions are going to tilt hard in one direction.
So, yeah, to that point, and to what Brian said and what you've all kind of alluded to, is this is the deeper issue is a war on our very foundational principles of the Constitution, of the family, and of faith. And look, I'm not overly a God-fearing man. I mean, I've done, I'm a Druid, just saying, not that I care, but I'm kidding. But I'm just saying that we need to actually examine the fact that, and if you go on Twitter, it's always, check this out. Let's just do it as a kind of a fun thing for some Saturday. All of the blue wave liberals, all these blue wave progressives that have their little blue wave part of the resistance movement, they're all freaking atheists. They're all socialists. There's a clue for you. So their entire movement, and those who are very vocal about supporting this, they always say, oh, by the way, they always have these little cute little kitty photos as their profile pictures. Like, oh, be kind. It's like, it's all a sham. It's all designed to put the best possible face on totalitarianism that they want to push here. It's really, I mean, it's obvious if you look for it. But this move by Blinken, I think, is the most direct thing I've seen in a long time of them trying to open the door to socialism and try to subordinate the United States and its interests to this larger, completely inept, but very evil organization known as the United Nations.
That very evil is exactly right. And I'll just give two quick instances. One is the amount of diplomatically protected drug smuggling that has been known to go on through the United Nations.
It's happened in Afghanistan.
But the delegations in New York in particular, who make money by smuggling stuff into the US. And that is only one small example. There are many others. I'll leave it there.
Look, there was about 8 years ago, credible allegations of ISAF, allowing for large drug shipments to be put on military aircraft returning to Europe.
Yep, absolutely.
And when we brought this up, it's like, oh, we don't want to investigate this. Like, really? Okay.
Gentlemen,
No.
there are other levels in this, though, and this is another issue, and I really wanted to bring this to you during this program. Allowing the UN to stick its tentacles into our nation's system could also open a host of residual problems, perhaps a peek into our military and intelligence secrets, our real economic situation, the dysfunctional and corrupt, in many ways, federal government system, information we really don't want to have other enemy nations or any other nations see or hear.
Chris, that's a good point. I think one thing that's important to remember when you're considering the UN is that the UN is not some objective third party. It's comprised of at least the permanent members of the UN are the United States, France, England, and then China and Russia, longtime competitors and at some points enemies of the United States. So if the UN is necessarily, in many cases, direct competitors of the United States, then opening ourselves up to this type of investigation, or at least having this level of access into our government under the guise of investigating whatever they want to call it at the time, is just foolishness, because China and Russia will absolutely use the opportunity, if given it to them, to benefit themselves. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So that's what we're setting ourselves up for.
If I may, there's one example of spying. It's historical now, but some of the worst damage ever done to the United States was through the United Nations, where the Soviet Union was allowed to run the United Nations library. They applied through the Library of Congress to get the plans for our nuclear aircraft carriers, and were given them.
Great example.
Think about that.
Hey, there's a reason that the Wilsons didn't want to join the League of Nations back in the day. Exactly.
And that's worth bringing up, Chris. The League of Nations and the UN, it's sort of child, if you will, were the original idea behind the League of Nations and the UN, or that they were a forum for the nations of the world to get together to discuss issues in order to preserve the peace. That quickly grew, both in the League of Nations as well as later in the UN, into a host of leaders of the world getting together to meddle in other nations' affairs across the board, economically, socially, culturally, as well as issues of peace, war and peace crossing borders. And so the result is we now have, with the UN, a host of commissions and organizations and use the rest of the alphabet as you will, spread around the world, doing all sorts of things in areas of labor, agriculture, industry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the thing you have to ask yourself, beyond the fact of how much money they're spending doing this, and the answer is a lot, is why are we letting them do that when there is very little evidence that there has been much true benefit to the average citizen of the average nation by all of these activities, but there has been an awful lot of power cornered into these various organizations and the people who run them. And it bears a real hard turn to take a look at the UN and look at all these organizations and ask ourselves, why are we funding them?
Let's also keep in mind the UN has done virtually nothing to deal with the Chinese Communist Party's international machinations and treatment of the Uyghurs, as well as their aggressive political tactics against Taiwan, their beatings of peaceful protesters in Hong Kong. Thus, why the obsession with the US?
Chris, if I can jump in here, I think it's important to remember that the Chinese, the Beijing government, if you will, the illegal government of China, has spent a great deal of time and effort getting themselves dug into virtually every commission, organization, or whatever in the UN, in particular the Commission on Civil Rights, Human Rights, and have used it essentially to browbeat people away from even considering the idea of investigating China. Meanwhile, they have developed a truly prodigious police state, which continues to grow in its ability to reach into virtually every facet of the average Chinese citizen's life. They are crushing the Uyghurs. There's 1 million or more in labor camps. Probably it's considerably more than 1 million. They are, the seizing of Tibet, the strangling of the water flow into Southeast Asia and South Asia. There's the list of crimes that the Chinese are going, the occupation of the South China Sea, which, by the way, 5 years ago last week, the permanent court in The Hague found that they had, in fact, clearly violated international law. The Chinese have done nothing. And it goes on and on and on. It's hard to know when to stop talking about the violations of the law and human rights perpetrated by Beijing, and yet the Beijing government stands up and points an accusing finger around the world. It's lunacy that we pay any attention to them at all.
If I can also add on top of that, if you look at the UN system and the UN organization of the actual headquarters building in Turtle Bay in New York, over the last 20 years, it used to be, before the Soviet Union fell, that they occupied a couple of floors. Now we have China has taken over at least 2, maybe as many as 4 floors high up in the building, which is always an indication of status within the UN. The higher your office is up on floors, the more important it is. They now have at least 2, maybe as many as 4 whole floors of people working on a whole variety of areas and projects, where basically if a round eye goes in there, it's like, what are you doing here?
The critique that we have is not just with the UN because it's the UN, but it's with the UN because as an entity of its size, of course it's going to become corrupt. And as an entity with the composition that it has, with the members that I mentioned, with Russia and China that have so much play, of course it's going to have problems. And, the UN was never designed, like Pete said, to be as big as it is. As a forum, it's a great idea that we have the world speaking together and working cooperatively. But once the UN starts to become and amass the entities that it has, and we lose track of the ability to have some accountability as to where it's focused or how voting blocks within the UN are affecting its decisions, then I think we've completely lost any use for the UN. And I think that's what we've seen happening. So just like any government that grows beyond accountability, the UN has done that. And that's what we're seeing is resulting in all of these problems that we're talking about. So inviting the UN into our government to try to lecture us about values and virtues, like I said previously, is just completely disingenuous.
If I can just jump in with one little anecdote. Yeah. I won't mention the country because I don't want to cause them any more grief than they already have, and they have a lot. But I was in a failed state that was trying to rebuild a number of years ago, and the UN was also there in large numbers. And one of the things that a buddy of mine, as we got off the airplane and we all had our uniforms on, had an American flag on the side, and he said, make sure you use a colored American flag so people can clearly see it. And I said, why is that? And he said, because they shoot at the UN flag. And it was yep. Kind of bizarre, but it was in fact true. Is the guys who were walking around with blue hats and had a UN flag on their arm were getting sniped at all the time. The guys with American flags on their arms, little kids are running up to us and saying, "Hey, Joe," and trying to get us to give them a candy bar and stuff. I mean, it was glaring that the folks on the ground, the poor people of that country, understood the gross level of corruption, and the corruption was glaring. And their answer was, sniping at the UN was okay. The Americans were here to help, but the folks at the UN, it was just corruption.
Yep. Yeah, a little known about the same thing in Afghanistan. The first 2 years after the entry, after we had completed our initial combat operations in 2002, 2003, we were loved by the Afghan people. The people who were being bombed was NATO, was ISIL, really. It was all the UN folks. The first major bombing, suicide bombing, was against a German bus, a German army bus that was going to the airport to fly their folks home. At the time, during that period, we were perceived, I believe rightly, you know, I wrote a book about this, you all know, is kind of, we were there to do a job, and if we could help, we would. But we weren't pretending to be the savior of the Afghan people.
Yeah.
We were just there to do business. And then people respected it. That was an issue of respect. Once the UN rolled in, they basically brought in with them this completely obvious corruption that the Afghan people saw. And think about, again, this is easily verified. Think about the billions of dollars the international community has spent and how little sustainable infrastructure that has been created.
And this is everywhere.
That's-
This is
that's-
East Africa.
that's an
It's
example
West
of UN.
Africa. It's you know, it's
Palestinian
Balkans.
territories
Yeah. Yeah, no.
who have been caught by the UN
So-
housing missiles and mortars in schools, and yet still are not
Right.
getting the same level of critique as Israel's getting. It's blatantly obvious, like Pete says.
Well, yeah, in Syria, I think is another place where they've done just horrendous damage to how to really bring that. You know, you never hear the UN talked about in favorable terms regarding bringing peace anymore, anywhere. Yeah.
I mean, on that one,
Yeah.
the mission in Lebanon has been there for 35 years and done nothing, less than nothing.
Yeah.
They apparently have helped with the movement of rockets and the digging of tunnels and
Exactly.
fortifications. It's
So, you know, as a matter of fact, I hate to say something politically controversial, but I don't think Trump went far enough in getting rid of these clowns. I mean,
absolutely.
that real estate in Manhattan, man, I would have, if you know, being a developer,
What a great
as Trump
hotel
was,
that
I
would
would have said, gentlemen, you've got a year to figure out a new place to go, but you're done. You need to go. Thank you for your service to world peace. Go do your world peace somewhere else. So
I actually think I would be happy for my tax money to be used to help them move to somewhere like Dubai.
Oh, maybe the Northwest Territories.
no, I think where did Jim Jones have his little compound, Reverend Jones?
Be realistic. Dubai would be a great place. It's got the airport, it's got the access, it's central to all of them. Short commutes and a long commute for us. I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
It'd be an interesting exercise to see how many countries reject a relocation of the UN.
Well, that would be
I
interesting.
bet
Yeah,
that
exactly. That
we
would
might
great.
be the only place. But again, we're all coming back to this principle of accountability. There's just no accountability left in the UN. No one is assessing whether we're achieving our goals and spending money wisely. And that's a big problem. And so now to throw this to them, this is nothing that seeks a solution. This is something that seeks a political victory, what Blinken has done.
Well put, Brian.
So, Brian, to that point, this should be something we remember to continue to debate and discuss as 2024 rolls around, because whoever becomes president is going to have to deal with this. This little injection, this poke by Blinken trying to get the UN into the nation is something that has to be examined. And I would examine this from the investigative perspective of why would you do this? If you just had the most secure election, all the minorities turned out, oh boy, you want to investigate that? Okay, that's kind of strange. So let's figure out why you did that, and more importantly, the future of the UN, because I know Trump was deeply suspicious and wanted to do something about it. Brian, I would argue that whoever becomes the next president, if they're open-minded, should consider helping the UN find the door. It's like, dude,
Absolutely. And the other thing is that it would help if everybody would raise the issue of
it's not me, it's you, or whatever,
how much money does the US spend on the United Nations? That is a hidden figure.
Trump held it back for a while, right?
Some of it. But it's a hidden figure. They keep talking about our core dues, and trust me that is less than 30% of the total amount we give. We give a lot of voluntary stuff as well, and it's billions and billions of dollars every year.
I'll also just throw in that fun fact. How many people tried to get into Cuba last year? How many people tried to get into China last year? Non-ethnic Chinese are trying. Ethnic Chinese, 1,500 got into China the last year. We have data on it. 1,500. They were all ethnic Chinese, all essentially returning home.
Yep.
How many people tried to get in the United States last year?
2 million.
right?
Yeah.
2 million. We're doing
A
between
lot.
1.5 and 2 million a year in the United States. 41% of all the immigrants in the world live in the United States. So when people start pointing fingers and saying, "Oh, bad America," my answer is people vote with their feet.
Yeah, of course. Well, I think that's a great point. And so I think our audience can be assured that we're going to continue to talk about this, especially regarding the framework, regarding the policy for the next election. In the meantime, I think we're unified in saying, UN, go home. Just don't show up. And this is something else I think, as some of our audience probably knows, we're working on some law enforcement enabling projects to look at how state and local officials can push back on stuff like this. I'd like to find states, if these guys show up, the UN shows up trying to do something like, examining, they are arrested. I don't know what they could be arrested on, but I'd find a way to arrest them if I were a local sheriff. But I think this is something that we cannot permit a foreign nation poking its nose into our internal politics, our internal processes. And as pointed out, we don't want them to have access to our national security at all. We don't want them to have access to anything because they're fundamentally corrupt. If they were a pristine, independent organization that had a record of doing good and was transparent, then that would be a completely different story, because I think there are huge issues, as we all know, with our election, huge issues, but nothing the UN is proposing will do anything at all to root out the corruption and integrity that we know exists. As a matter of fact, it would be made worse.
Thank you again for being with us for this edition of Thought to Action, presented by the London Center for Policy Research. Once again, join us on Patreon, patreon.com/thought2action, to help us produce this content and enjoy exclusive content, sneak previews of Thought to Action, and intensive Ask Us Anything sessions. Subscribe to us on YouTube, Dailymotion, or Rumble. And while on YouTube, hit that big red bell for updates so you know what we're putting up and when. Also, please feel free to comment on our discussion, and this information needs to be made available, so it would really help us out greatly is if you would share this with friends, colleagues, and your social network. I'm Chris Cordani for our panel and the London Center for Policy Research. Thank you again for joining us. Find out more about us on the website, londoncenter.org.